might be the earthquake or flood that is oftentimes hard to insure, as well as anything that new that pops up. So more recently, this might have been a cyber liability policy 5 years ago, something to this end. We're here to our first sort of what do you think? Are there other surplus lines examples that you might think of, other situations where surplus lines market might come into play? Feel free to answer in the chat.
And they can put comments in the question and answer box, and we'll share them as we see them.
Okay, well, at least one person mentions zoos. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good idea, a good example. A relatively unique risk. You have animals that can that if we think of them as property themselves, there could be a loss. If they cause a loss to a human, could happen. I'll also add, whenever you see those TV shows of buildings imploding, this would be a relatively unique situation where high-risk situation where the losses could be really high, and oftentimes you find coverage in this E&S market. Okay, that's a good question. There are some. The question that we just got is reinsurance under E&S. The reinsurance market and the E&S market are separate. You do see some reinsurers position themselves as E&S providers, but technically they're sort of what we would think of as sort of separate markets. But you could have a reinsurer to call themselves and surplus provider, but they're not synonymous, in other words. All right, very good question. All right, and then lastly, before we talk about reinsurance, I'll provide a nice little segue here in a second. E&S is somewhat unique. Again, so we mentioned this idea of a standard market. When you think about the standard market, the state farms and nationwide, these are sort of registered in the various states. They're legislated by the states. They're regulated by the states. E&S insurers are not. So they are oftentimes what they refer to as a non-admitted insurer. And we won't get into it here, but there are some advantages and disadvantages to that for the insurer as well as the insured. But at this point, you can just suffice it to say that they're not technically licensed in the state. That doesn't mean they can't sell insurance, but they have to do it on a much different basis. In fact, the way that is done is through what they call an E&S broker. So unlike State Farm and Nationwide, we can't just walk up to an E&S provider and buy insurance. Rather, we have to have someone else, that is an E&S broker, to place that business for us. That broker will have a list, will know who they can use. Some states maintain lists of approved insurers. Some states just maintain the opposite of non-approved insurers, to say you can't use these. But at the end of the day, the states do regulate these slightly differently, but it's still available to even individual policyholders. All right, and then as promised, we had a question a minute ago about reinsurance. Again, a nice segue. Reinsurance, as I mentioned, is not synonymous with E&S. Reinsurance provides a solution to a specific problem, and that is one of where do insurance companies get insurance. And in general, reinsurance is not really any different than insurance. It's, to that end, it's a relatively easy concept. And all it really is an insurance company simply buying insurance for the insurance that they've sold. So you can imagine, I'm using State Farm, I know a lot. Here's an example of them selling a lot of policies and then packaging those policies that they sold and transferring that risk or that liability to another insurance company. And that is effectively the reinsurance transaction. If the losses on that sort of bulk business are high enough, then State Farm will receive some compensation from their insurer. But at the end of the day, it's simply insurance for insurance companies. There are slight differences in the terminology. So in fact, you oftentimes see the word ceding or cedant being referred to, referring to the insurance companies that are doing the, they're engaging in the transaction. You'll see this notion of a ceding commission, which is effectively the same thing as a premium. And so again, it's effectively the same thing as primary insurance, except now the insurance company is buying it. You can also imagine that this does not stop with one insurer, it doesn't have to reinsure anyway. So they have what they call retrocessions, where a reinsurer will buy reinsurance from another reinsurer, and this situation can go on sort of infinitely if necessary. But again, it's a way for insurance companies to sort of protect themselves if they have significant losses. Now, the good news for an individual is that they typically don't see any of this transaction, nor is it that important to them. So in fact, the primary policyholder, that is the policyholder that buys the insurance from State Farm, could really care less as to whether or not State Farm buys a reinsurance or not. Indeed, the primary policyholder will rarely see any part of that transaction or be involved in any part of that transaction. And indeed, that transaction does not make State Farm or the primary insurance company not responsible to the primary insurer. They still maintain the responsibility to the insurer, to the insured, which they sell the policy to. They now just have a little backup should they have significant losses. Two exceptions to this are what they refer to as a cut-through endorsement. This occurs when typically a larger insured is going to want to make sure that their insurer is solvent, and if not, they can collect from the reinsurer. And another situation occurs, again, with the relatively large insureds when they use captives. So if a big company basically sets up their own insurance company, they primarily do this to access the reinsurance market. And so really these are the two sort of primary exceptions to when the primary insured would be dealing with the reinsurer themselves, but these are typically used for relatively large policyholders or relatively large insured. All right, and then our last little module here, last little portion, is this notion of workers' compensation. This represents yet another slight shift in sort of our focus, in that we've talked about individual lines of insurance, homeowners and property, and the auto coverage. We talked about a couple of insurance markets. But here, workers' compensation is typically what we think of as a commercial insurance line. That is, we have workers' compensation insurance anyway, is bought by companies, businesses that are required to do something, I'll say generically, under the workers' compensation statutes. All right, so before we actually talk about the insurance itself, let's just point out that workers' compensation typically refers to, generically anyway, the laws that are required, that are set up by the states to protect employees when they have injuries on the job. So indeed, most states have some sort of workers' compensation statute that provide, that require that their employers, thank you, that provide that their employers provide some sort of financial responsibility for any sort of loss that occurs on the job. This workers' compensation statute does not say that they have to buy insurance for this. We'll discuss that in a second. Rather, that only that the employer has to be responsible for those losses that occur on the job. This responsibility is done, again, on a no-fault basis. We've seen that before. So, again, there doesn't have to be any liability. No one says it's the employee or the employer's fault. If it happens on the job, sort of by definition, it's covered under the workers' compensation law or the statute in that state. Different states have different rules as to what's covered, what's not covered. That's a little bit beyond the scope of this discussion, but do recognize that your state might differ from a neighboring state. Again, the idea, as with any no-fault coverage, is to sort of go ahead and get the coverage, the loss paid, do it without the use of the court system, so we're trying to minimize legal burdens, litigation costs, et cetera. The coverage